What's up creators, I hope you're doing well. I'm Tony Fuentes, welcome back to my channel. Today we're returning to the alias series where we break down the styles of famous photographers. Now the style that we're going to break down today is Cason Grzegoczyk. Now Carssun, otherwise known as Carssun, is a profile that one of you guys suggested in the comment section on a previous video. So if you have any suggestions for profiles for me to break down and analyze, put it down in the comment sections and I'll check them out. Okay, you know how this works. First of all, we're going to jump into Instagram and check out his style, break down what he does in the color grading, and then in Lightroom we're going to create a preset out of it and see how it performs on different scenarios. Okay, so let's jump into it. Okay, so here we have Carsun's profile on Instagram, Carssun, if you want to go and follow him. And also you can check out his shop where you can buy his LUTs and his presets directly from him. Remember that the purpose of my tutorials is to use these profiles just as an example, as an exercise to learn how to analyze and learn how to color grade in Lightroom. So I'm not here to steal their styles or anything like that. Okay, first of all, if we take a broader look at his style, we can immediately see that, well, he shoots a lot of lifestyle photography, a lot of model photography, and all of it is in the mid sunshine. So it's a very beautiful style to apply in daylight photography. Now, all of his images, well, most of his images are shot with film cameras, but also he shoots with Canon with digital SLRs, meaning that he's homologating the style that is replicated from his film cameras into his digital photography by using presets and editing in Lightroom. So as you can see, his feed is very curated and has very beautiful models. So before YouTube censors this video, let's jump into specifics. So throughout his feed, he has so many styles, but there's one that really stands out, which is this one that we can see right now. First thing that I can notice is the high amount of grain. You can see that the image is very rough, is losing a lot of sharpness because he's adding so much film grain into the image. Then you can see how the image is very flat, representing, well, film photography. You can see how the blacks have a lot of information, but they're also very faded. We don't see any pure blacks in the image, nor we can see any pure whites. So he's lowering the highlights and whites and bringing up the shadows and the blacks to achieve this high dynamic range. Then if we jump into this other image of this model, we can see a similar story, but immediately you can see how it's very desaturated. Apart from being very flat, there's little to no contrast or differentiation between the shadows and the highlights. You can see that every other color is a bit desaturated, just making it a bit more analog, a bit more black and white. He also applies this style into other types of photography, for example, street photography. And right here we can see this set of images in Ibiza, Spain, and it's basically the same preset. Just in this case, he alters a bit of the blues, so the sea isn't completely desaturated and unnatural. So this preset also works perfectly with lifestyle photography. And in this last image, we can notice how the blacks are so raised, they're very faded out, and the highlights are dimmed down. So this is something that we have to keep in mind. For example, in this portrait of this gorgeous lady, there's one thing that I have to keep in mind right here. Look at the skin tones, how they're a bit more tan, a bit more orangey, and in particular, look at that blue in the volleyball. You can see how it's very vivid, it's very vibrant, and there's a lot of saturation tend towards the teal colors. Now, this is telling me that in camera calibration, he's adding or moving the blue primary to affect the blues and the skin tones and give them a lot more vibrance and a lot more presence. So we have to keep that in mind if we're going to replicate his style. Now, in general, this is the style that most repeats on his feed. Yes, he may add a bit more warm temperature in some of them, a bit more contrast in others, but in general, it's this same base style. So we're going to replicate this one. Then he has another one that really caught my eye, which is this one, where we can see that the image has a lot more contrast than the previous examples. Also, the skin tones are so yellow compared to someone that has jaundice, and also the film grain is a lot more controlled. And notice in particular, the sky has a lot more saturation than in the previous styles. In this close-up portrait of this beautiful model, we can see again how the image is a lot more contrasty, and immediately we can see those yellow or completely orange skin tones. And then lastly, once again, this style appears in these images in Rio de Janeiro, where you can see that there's a lot more contrast. We can see in particular in the umbrella's house, there's a lot more saturation in the other tones, with the exception of the greens in the background, which are very desaturated, and then the people are just little orange sticks sticking out in the sea and in the sand. So this style also we're gonna create. So creators, I think I have everything I need to replicate his style. We're gonna start off by creating two presets. The first one is gonna be the style that we saw at the start, which is a lot more faded and desaturated, and then this one, which is a lot more contrasty with those orangey skin tones. Then I'm going to show you a quick way to convert these two presets into the black and white equivalents, because he does use a lot of black and white in his photography. So we're going to create in total 4 presets today, and these 4 presets are also going to be added into the Edit Preset Pack V2. In case you want to check it out and support me, the link is up here. In there, you're going to find all the presets that we create throughout this series. So if color grading isn't your thing, that's a great way you can support me and skip my tutorials. So having said that, let's jump into Lightroom. Okay guys, here in Lightroom I have all these images. All of them are shot at midday with harsh sunlight, so the presets will work perfectly. So I don't have any beautiful models, so I'm just gonna edit a photo of myself to start off with. Okay, so first of all, let's create the flat and desaturated preset, the first one that we broke down. Now, in Lightroom Classic or Lightroom Desktop or Mobile, I like to work first of all with exposure and contrast, moving down to color grading, and finally to effects. So it's the same process. Now here in the basic corrections, we're going to start off by creating a flatter image. Now the temperature, tint, exposure and contrast, these four values, I like to leave them at 0 and not include them in the preset, because these are the values I'm going to move around when the photograph maybe is a bit too underexposed or overexposed, and to compensate just to make the preset work for every photograph. So starting off with the highlights, we don't want to go to the -100. Instead, we're just going to bring it down ever so slightly so we have just a bit more information in the blown out parts of the image around the -8 or 7%. Then the shadows, not to the +100, but something around the 50s is going to be enough. Just bring in a lot more information in the dark parts of the image. Then the white, we're going to control the brightest parts of our image, so we're going to go to the negatives as well, around the -35. In this way, we can ensure that we don't have any blown out parts or overexposed parts in our photograph. Then the blacks, we don't want to go to the negatives, otherwise we add a lot more contrast. We want to go to the positives, just enough to fade all those blacks out just a bit. You can see the before and after, and we're just making the image a lot more flat. And don't worry, we still have a way to go. We have to go to the tone curve. That controls also the exposure and contrast. But for the time being, it's looking quite nice. Then we're going to move down to presence. Now presence, texture, clarity, dehaze, these values, I'm not going to add them towards the positives, because if we go to the positives, we add a lot of digital sharpness, which isn't what we want. We want an image which is a lot more raw, a lot more natural and analog. So in this case, we're going to go to the negatives. So not going to go too harsh, maybe a -15 in the clarity just to make the image a lot less contrasty, and a -10 in the texture. Next, we're going to move down to vibrance and saturation, and these two values may seem that they do the same thing, but they're a bit different. Now saturation affects every single color in the same amount. Meanwhile, vibrance is a bit more selective. It doesn't affect the colors that are most dominant in each image. So Lightroom right here would decide that blue and greens maybe are the most dominant colors in this image, and they're not going to affect them too much by the moves that we do in that slider. So what we're going to do is bring down the saturation just to desaturate most of the tones around the -15. But then the vibrance, I'm going to put it up just to bring up a bit of the saturation in the important colors of our images. So around the +10 or +11 is going to be enough. So that way we're affecting only the saturation on the greens and also in the blues, just bringing them up. Meanwhile, we're desaturating most of the other colors. Next, the tone curve. Now the tone curve will allow us to control the exposure and contrast, and here we're going to add those final touches into the exposure and the flattening and fading out of the blacks. Now if you don't know how the tone curve works, you can check out my tutorial up here, also my tutorial on camera calibration, color grading, all those tools. I've already made specific tutorials so you can master them. So here I'm not going to explain too much. I'm going to create a point in the shadows and a point in the highlights. First of all, we want those faded out blacks, so I'm going to pull the darkest part of our image, put it up, and as you can see, the blacks start to fade out and become a bit more gray. Now I don't want to go all the way to the extreme, maybe around 24%. And right here you can see the input and the output, and these are basically coordinates for each point. So right here we have 0 in the x-axis and then 24 in the y-axis. So if you want to be a bit more precise and just do the same things that I do, you can always just pause the video when I finally get the point to where I want and just copy the settings and just type them in each of the values over here. So for example, the shadows, I'm going to pull them up above the diagonal so we fade out those shadows as well. Not too much as well. We want to go ever so slightly around here. And the values is going to be 51 on the X and the output is going to be 63. In that way, we're fading out those blacks and those shadows as well. Next, the midtones, I'm going to leave them like that, but the white, this point over here, controls the brightest parts of our image. I'm going to bring it down so we make sure we don't have anything overexposed on our image. I'm just going to bring it down, and these are the values in case you want to pause the video. So this is what the tone curve has done. This is before and after. Now the image is a lot more flat. So that's it for the exposure and contrast. Next, let's move into the color, and we're going to start off with camera calibration. Now this tool is tremendously powerful. It allows us to control the RGB. Every single color in our image is composed by the reds, the greens, and the blues, and this tool allows us to control those tones. So if we move one of the sliders, we're basically affecting the entirety of the image. Now the only problem with this tool is that it isn't available in Lightroom Mobile. It is available in the desktop versions. So let's start off by affecting the greens. The greens in the images that we saw of Carssun are a bit desaturated and tend towards the warmer tones. So what I'm going to do is pull the hue of the green primary towards the negatives. We don't want to go towards the positives, otherwise our colors or green colors tend towards the emeralds. We want to go to the negatives just a bit, not too much, otherwise the entire image will be a bit unnatural, or under -20. And then the saturation, we're just going to drag it down just a bit, just to make those greens a bit more muted. Next, I'm going to go to the blue primary. Now, blue primary is going to be very important, but for our second preset right here, we're not going to move it too much, because if we move it all the way down to the -100, notice how the skin tones are a lot more orangey, and if we bump up the saturation, they are completely orange, like in the second preset that we want to achieve. Now this is a bit too extreme for this one, so what I'm going to do is just go ever so slightly towards the negatives, just to affect a bit of the blues and make them a bit more towards the aquas, just a bit more retro, and the saturation, just pull it down as well. This will affect large parts of the sky, but also the bodies of water that we can see in our images. Maybe we're taking a photo at sea, we want it to be a bit more light. Then a red primary will affect a lot of the greens as well, because it's direct opposite in the color wheel of the greens. So what I'm going to do is not go towards the negatives, otherwise notice how our skin tones are a lot more magenta, and our greens tend towards the emeralds once again. We want to go to the positives as well, not too much, otherwise right here I'm a Simpson. Just a bit to the positives, around the +8, just to make our greens a bit more warm and also our skin tones a bit more tan. Then a -4, just desaturate just a bit. So that's camera calibration. It's a very subtle change, but it will affect our entire image, just making it a bit more retro. So we can deactivate it right here, and then we can activate it, and it's very subtle. Maybe you guys through the screen, through YouTube, you can't even notice the difference, but for me it's very noticeable. Next up, let's go to HSL. Now in HSL we can basically change the hue, the saturation, and how bright or dark each color is in our image. So in hue, I'm going to start off by moving the red and the oranges. These two colors will control the skin tones in most of the cases. Now I don't want to go towards the negatives, otherwise our skin tones tend towards the magentas. We want skin tones which are a lot more tan, or at least that's what I saw in his images. So what I'm going to do is go towards the positives, not too much, but enough just to add a bit more warm tones into our skin. Then the oranges as well, we don't want to go towards the yellows, otherwise, well, I look horrible. I want to go towards the negatives as well, around the warmer tones. Maybe a -15 is going to be enough. In this way, we're just achieving more warmer or tan skin tones. Now in my case, I'm just pale and clammy, so it doesn't apply to me. Next, we're going to go to the vegetation. We want it to be a bit more yellowish and a bit more desaturated. Now the yellows control a lot of the vegetation and plants in our image. As you can see, if I move it around, how the plants turn drastically their color. So what I'm going to do is go towards the negative, just make them a lot more warm, on the -44, and the greens will control darker parts of our foliage. Again, move it down as well, or the -25 or 23 is going to be enough. And finally, the aquas, that will control some parts of the ocean and some parts of the sky. In this case, I'm going to move them towards darker tones, not towards the greens. We don't want green water, that's horrible. We want to go towards the positives, on the +20, to make them a bit more dark. Next, we're going to go to saturation, and here we're going to desaturate some of the tones. So let's start off with the aquas as well. I'm going to pull it down just a bit, just to make them a bit less noticeable, less bright in our images. And then the greens and the yellows, these ones, we're going to desaturate them just a bit. Just going to bring down a bit of the saturation around the -25 of the greens, and around the -20 in the yellows as well. And now we have those greens which are a lot more muted, a lot more desaturated, and tend towards the warmer tones that we saw in his images. In general, this is making our entire image to be a bit more warm. Next, let's move down to color grading, which is one of my favorite tools. Now here we can add basically a tint to the shadows, a tint to the midtones, or to the highlights, or we can use another wheel that I don't normally use, which is the global color wheel, which is all the way towards the right over here. Here we have the global, and this one will basically add a color to the entirety of our image, just like if you would add another layer in Photoshop with a solid color into your image. So right here, we can basically add some saturation, and as you can see, the color is added to the entirety of the image. Now what I want to do here is just add maybe an orange tone, very subtle, to the entirety of the image, so it's a bit more creamy and a bit more warm in general. Like all of his images are very warm, and we don't have to move the temperature slider for each of our images. So what I'm going to do is just play around with the hue. Maybe I'm going to go with a hue around the 40, and the saturation is a bit too extreme. We want a very subtle touch, maybe around the 14% is going to be enough. And as you can see, this is without, and with just making the image a bit more creamy and a bit more warm. So that's it for color grading. Now let's move down to the effects. Here we have vignetting, but also we have grain. Now grain is a very important part in his style. Now, one thing that I have to keep in mind before we start editing grain is that the size of the grain that appears on your image will depend on the resolution of the image that you're editing. So for example, right here I have a 24 megapixel image from my APS-C camera, and if I apply a certain amount of grain, it's going to look very different in this image compared to an image shot in a full frame camera with higher megapixels. The grain is going to be a bit smaller, so you have to keep that in mind, and maybe you have to adjust it depending on the resolution of your own camera. So right here, first of all, for my camera at least, I'm going to add some amount. Now I don't want to go all the way to the extreme, that's a bit too harsh for me. Maybe around the 50s is going to be enough. If you want to be a bit more extremist with the grain, you can go ahead. Then the size, I'm going to bring it up. In this case it's going to be quite high, around this plus 79. And then the roughness, just pull it up just a bit. And now we can see the before and after, and this is our original image, which was a lot more contrasty. Now we have a flatter image with more tan skin tones, faded out blacks, and that nice film gray that we were looking for. Now let's save the preset, apply it to different photos, and see if we have to modify some of the settings. So I'm going to go to the left panel over here, hit the plus sign under presets, create a preset, and remember right here white balance, exposure, and contrast. I'm not going to mark them, neither lens corrections, transform, but I am going to check grain. So I'm going to create it. Okay, so here I have this portrait. Let's apply the preset to see how it performs. And this is the before and after, and it's looking very nice actually. We have that warm cast in general image. It's flat, it's desaturated, and it has that very nice film grain. It actually works quite nice. How about in this random image that I took in Korčula in Croatia? Let's apply the preset once again, and it's looking very nice. Remember that you can always add some temperature if you want the image to be a bit more warm. As you can see, these values are basically at 0 because we didn't include them in the preset. So here we can add maybe a bit more warmth into the image by putting up the temperature, and now it's looking a bit more candid. It's looking quite nice. How about in this one that I took in Hvar, also in Croatia? Let's apply the preset once again. And there we have it. It's looking fantastic actually. As you can see, the greens are a bit desaturated, the blues are also a bit dimmed down. So in this case, in this specific case, because we have a large amount of blues in our image, I would return a bit of the saturation of the aquas and the blues, just return them to the zeros, just to make the blues in the ocean not unnatural. But it's looking quite nice. We can see that harsh film grain, that warm tone in the entirety of the image. We can also add a bit more temperature if we want, and there we have it. Okay, so that's for the flat preset. Now let's create the other one, which is a bit more contrasty and a bit more saturated. Now we're going to use the preset that we just made as a basis, so we don't have to make it from scratch. And let's start off by adding more contrast. So here I have the original image that we started out editing. So what I'm going to do, first of all, the vibrance and saturation, I'm going to return them, just double click on the sliders to make them at 0. And then in the tone curve, the point in the shadows, which controls the shadows, I'm just going to drag it down below the diagonal to achieve more contrast. Now we don't want to go too harsh, otherwise it's too contrasty to be a film shot image. So just going to put it up just below the diagonal, just a bit, something around those lines, and we're consequently making the curve affect also the midtone. So it's looking a bit more punchy, a bit more contrasty. Next, we're going to go down to camera calibration, and here we're going to be a bit more extreme with the blue primary, just to add more orange into the skin tones and more aquas into the blues. So we're going to pull down the hue towards the negatives. I think around the -50 is going to be enough, not too much, but immediately you can notice how the skin is a lot more orange than in the original, and it's just what we were looking for. And then the saturation, I'm just going to put it up around the 9% is going to be enough, just to make the blues and the oranges a bit more vibrant. Then in saturation, again, the blues and the aquas, in this case I'm going to return them to 0. We don't want any desaturated blues in our image. And then finally we're going to go down to film grain, and notice that the film grain right here is a bit too big. So what I'm going to do is reduce the size just a bit more bearable and a bit more natural, something around those lines. So if compared to the original one, immediately you can see what we did with the skin tones, making them a lot more yellow, and this image is a lot more saturated compared to the previous preset with a lot more contrast. Now let's save it and see how it performs on other images. So I'm going to save it once again, and here we have the image with the flat preset applied, the one that we did previously. Now let's apply the new one to see how it differs, and immediately we can see how it's a lot more contrasty with those orangey skin tones are more saturated. How about this one that I took in Seville? We can see how the flat one reduces the contrast of the image, making it a lot more flat, no blacks, and desaturates basically all the colors. And now let's see the other version that I created that creates a more saturated look, more contrasty, and adds those orangey skin tones in particular. And what we did in camera calibration really affects most of the colors, making them look a bit more retro, a bit more film. You can see it in the blues in particular, how they're a bit more aqua. The reds are a lot more vibrant and orangey. It's looking very nice. How about in this image that I took in Dubrovnik, Croatia? Let's apply first of all the fade. And it's looking very nice. I would add a bit more temperature to this image just to make it a bit more warm. But then let's apply the one that has a bit more contrast, which is called Real. And there we have it, a very nice image. Maybe in this case just reduce temperature back, and we have those blues which are really popping a lot more. We have those orange really making a lot more emphasis, and it's looking very nice. Now, as promised, I will show you how to create the little variants, the black and white variants of each preset. Now really it's a very simple process. What we're gonna do is just select one of the presets. This is the faded one, and we're gonna select V on your keyboard. Now immediately our interface changes into Adobe Monochrome, and as you can see we don't have any sliders for hue or for saturation over here. We only have the luminance tab, and basically this is the same preset. It retains the grain that we added, it retains the contrast and all the corrections minus the color grading, and we can save it once again as a separate preset. Then we can apply the second preset that we created, which is called Real. And again, we can select V on your keyboard, and we can save this one as more of a contrasty version of the same preset. So let's see the presets with these two ladies. Here we have the faded one. Then we can apply Real, which is a lot more saturated. It's looking very nice in this image in particular. Then we can apply maybe the black and white. This is the fade one. And look at the difference with the black and white Real, which is a bit more punchy, a bit more contrast. So guys, these 4 presets that we just created are in the Edit-like Preset Pack V2, but also the Edit-like LUT Pack V2. So I've already converted these presets for photography into LUTs, so you can apply them to your video as well. So check them out up here if you want to support me. Also, if you want to binge watch all the Edit-like series, here's the playlist in case you want to check it out. I'm Tony Fuentes. Like the video, subscribe, all those things. Cheers to all of you, and I'll see you in the next one.